No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, we're going to be going over part 3 in this 4-part series we've been talking about on overcoming dysfunctions of a team that might lead it to be not high performing. And if we define high performing as, the ability to deliver whatever the expected results are with roughly the same people over a sustained period of time, that is really difficult to do if you have a lot of these or any of these dysfunctions on your team. 2 weeks ago, we talked about if a team lacks trust amongst the team members. Last Monday, we talked about how sometimes avoidance or a fear of conflict can cause a problem on your team if people aren't they don't have the psychological safety to have these discussions out in the open. On this week's episode, I want to talk about how a lack of commitment can get there. Commitment is it's a tough one because, we talk about in this day and age, people can define commitment differently. We talk about people who want to go to work, get their work done, and then go home, or whatever that is, and they look at just even someone suggesting that they lack commitment as them suggesting that there's a lack of them going above and beyond or doing more work than what they're actually being paid to do. But that's not necessarily what this is. Lack of commitment when it comes to team members can be an insidious thing that kind of trickles down to all the team members. And it's one of those things where you kind of don't notice that it's happening until it's already too late. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of those things where we tend to, I think in some instances, like overused kind of the word commitment based upon like our own projection of the definition of what we think. And then many times our own commitment should be questioned. It's one of those situations where it's just one of those words that get tossed around a lot. And I think when we're talking about the context of high-performing teams, the idea of commitment in my mind is that you have a collection of people that would really that really want to do a good job, that really understand that there is a structure and there are expectations, and that they want to see the team succeed, and they want to see whatever the outcome is be a really, really good outcome. And so I share that kind of generally because that doesn't mean that one person's like, I'm going to put in 60 hours this week on that project commitment versus the other person's, I'm going to put in 45 hours. You're saying that's like a commitment. No, I don't see it that way. I think that based upon the responsibilities, based upon that idea, maybe the person that does the 45 hours is more productive. They're more efficient with their time. Maybe the role that they play is a different type of role. And so when I think of commitment, I think of that is everybody in the room really wanting to see the best level of success that we can do collectively. And then we can start to work through what are those expectations, or how do we make sure that the work is kind of shared out, it's fair and it's equitable across the larger team. But I think that commitment piece is really about that, because if you can raise your hand and say, I'm committed to us doing the best work that we can do, and I could ask everybody around to ask that question and say, okay, then that means there are going to be times when we're going to have to work harder. There's going to be times when we're going to have to challenge our own thoughts. There's going to be times when, we're going to have conversations about making sure that all of us are doing the best that we can do in the role that we have. And so that's kind of how I think of commitment, in this context of high-performing teams, because I think that outside of that word can be used a lot of different ways, and there can be a lot more maybe stringent or specific structure or expectations that are assigned to it. But in the world of high-performing teams in leadership, I think to me that's really what it means.
Yeah, the word commitment can be weaponized very easily when you are trying to imply that you're doing better or more important or more committed work than a coworker is. I think, this is a leadership podcast, and if you're a leader, where your responsibility lies in making sure that there isn't a lack of commitment on your team is to make sure that you are being very clear on what the objectives are. because a lot of times two people who are working very, very hard towards two different goals or two different outcomes will view each other as not committed, because they're not. They're not committed to each other's outcomes. They're committed to their own outcomes or their own priorities. And if you as a leader haven't kind of whittled all those down to whatever the team priorities are, then that's on you. If you could have two people who are very committed, they're working towards their goals. I look back to, just being a retail employee, a line level retail employee, and depending on which of my leaders, which of my managers was working that day, I'd have different goals. If it was the person whose bonus was on how much labor was spent, then the goal would be to cut as many people and send them home as quickly as we could. And if the manager that was with me or working with me was the one who was bonused on the store revenue, it would be to, how do we get more people in? How do we call more employees in to make sure that every single customer gets helped within 2 seconds? So you clearly have two different people. They're both very committed, but they're committed to two different things. And it can look like a lack of commitment. To one of them, you're not committed to keeping our labor in check. To the other one, you're not committed to this customer experience, right? And neither is true. They just have different priorities, which means you as the leader have not done a good job setting up what the actual team priorities are in a way that allows people to see each other's work and say, yep, we are all equally committed to whatever this kind of collective goal is. If you've set up the team objectives clearly, if you're aligned, not just one-on-one with people, but in a group setting, aligning with them on what the priorities are, and kind of, we talk about this in our the acronym, our culture acronym of changing the culture of a team. The L in culture is lend air support, which means, kind of holding up the shield as the leader and kind of, blocking the arrows coming in from all the sources that don't matter, all the things that might take your people off track because they're coming from people who have different objectives, who have different, they're committed to different things. They're all coming in. It's your job to kind of sort through that and make sure that your individual team members don't hear that kind of noise that might lead them to believe that there are other commitments that are more important. Now, that also means you as the leader, the buck stops with you. If you are kind of helping your team get to that point where you're deciding what the commitments are, now you have to own that. And that's fine. That's what you should be doing. But it will allow your team members to kind of look at the work that each person is doing and say to themselves, yep, my team members, my coworkers, my colleagues, they're all committed to the same thing that I'm committed to.
Yeah, I think the other part of it too, where if you're looking at this and saying like, do we have real commitment, is how often are you kind of reintroducing the same strategies over and over and over again? I overhear this term and I try to correct it when I hear it, but kind of like the back to the basics thing. And I'm just like, can we just call it resetting expectations?
Yeah.
Right. Because like, what are you going back to? And like what are the basics? And like so much of this has evolved, but I'm saying let's reset expectations. But I share that because there are times when it's like, man, I just heard this strategy. I was just on this call. I just had this conversation with this person around an approach to what we want to do. And this sounds like exactly the same thing that we were talking about 5 years ago. And it's kind of like, so then are we really committed to doing this work if we continue to have the same strategies and ideas repeated over and over again? Or if you feel like, oh, you know what, like it's good, like the training thing again is one of those situations. Like if you're hiring constantly and you have a lot of attrition and turnover, then training is definitely a major part of creating consistency within a team. If you're not seeing these big, jumps in hiring, if you're not continually adding to your team, and you've had people that have a little bit of tenure there, then like going back to training again and training on something they've already been trained on, in my mind, is again just talking about just lack of commitment. And I'm not saying that the team is lacking commitment. Sometimes it's the leaders, and many times it's the leaders that lack commitment in the follow-up, in the recognition or the accountability, in making sure that whatever they were trained on, that they have retained and they know how to do it, and they're in a position to observe the thing or the behavior that you're asking them to go do. But when you see these things repetitive over and over again, that to me kind of screams that there's a lack of commitment somewhere in making sure that whatever this thing is, that it actually is having some real kind of drive behind it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think another place where this kind of rears its head is when you have people who they're there, but they're not there. And what I mean by that is just in the general participation in group discussion, they just don't seem they seem to be almost apathetic to whatever's going on. And this might seem like a back to our previous episode on a fear or avoidance of conflict. This isn't what that is. This isn't a person wants to say something but doesn't feel like they can. It's that they actually no longer have the desire to say something that goes against what someone else says. Not because they're afraid of the outcome, but because they don't care about the outcome. They don't care what it is. So even if if they were forced to think about it, they might think it was a bad idea. They're just going to go along with it anyway, because at the end of the day, it's just they don't care enough about the outcome. They just care about putting their head down and doing what they've been told to do, and not thinking about ways that they can make the business better, whatever that is. It's this kind of this absenteeism that exists, that where they're in the building or they're in the Zoom call or wherever it is that people get together, but you can tell their mind isn't in it. They're not kind of participating. This is the kind of thing that can happen when a person is not committed to their job, or they're not committed to you as a leader or to their teams. It's typically not something that starts right away, because why would you go to work someplace if that's what your goal was to just go there and then do nothing. These are people who have gotten a job because they feel like this is the right place for them. They want to be able to make a difference. They want to be able to bring their ideas, and somewhere along the line that didn't work out for them. And instead of kind of fighting the good fight or going through these elements of conflict, they've just decided to, I'm just going to bide my time and kind of check out. And when the job market is tougher, when people have a harder time finding different jobs, this is much more likely to happen. When the job market is great and people can kind of go from one place to another, you see this a little bit less often. People just leave. They leave a job that they can't get that out of after a long enough period of time, because that's no fun. No one wants to be in a place where they actually don't care about what's going on. It's important to a lot of people, to most people, that they actually care about what their organization does, and they feel like that they can impact that in some way. And so this is a really insidious way where this lack of commitment can look like everybody's aligned and everybody's cohesive, but you still end up not performing at a high level because people really aren't committed.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that for me, what I hear sometimes in commitment is like, if you have a lack of commitment or a dysfunction around commitment on a team, then it's usually one of two things, and both of them go back to the leader. It's either the selection process of like, who are you selecting for the team? Who are you hiring for a team? How are you considering and thinking about someone who has a level of commitment to something, and that's a skill or a behavior that you're looking for? How are you thinking about that? Or if you hire somebody in and then there becomes this lack of commitment, like most of the time, 90% of the time, that's going to come down to leadership engagement. And how are you checking in? How are you connecting with that person? How are you validating their work? How are you, providing them a work environment where they get recognition and it's clear what the expectations are? Like, how are those things happening? There are definitely times when life will cause people to have to reprioritize, or something will happen where maybe their lack of commitment at work will be impacted 100%. Like, that's going to happen from time to time. But I think the vast majority of what we see from a commitment standpoint has a much larger reflection on the leader and the way in which they lead people, which is why when you look at all the surveys that we see and all the different things that are going on, they talk about engagement. They talk about the number one thing being like their leader or their manager, and what does that look like, and how is that relationship a thing. So I definitely think that for me, a big chunk of this is really in the hands of a leader being able to assess talent and a leader being able to develop talent.
Yeah, that's so spot on there, because when you talk about the responsibility of a leader to do this, these are cycles that you don't get out of if the leader does not step in. So if a person is not committed to their work, and it's a new thing, you notice this is a new thing. You've seen this person be committed before, that they're working hard, they're getting their job done, and there's a decline in that. if you as a leader don't address that, not from a criticism standpoint, but from a genuine curiosity standpoint, that comes from a place of empathy and wanting to see the person succeed, just having that conversation can hasten that person returning back to that level. Because if something's going on in their personal life that is bothering them, or that is kind of taking their focus and their commitment away, that's a human thing. That there's nothing wrong with that. That will happen to every person at some point in time. And if you as a leader do what you can to help assist that person in getting through that thing, even if there's nothing you can do for the actual problem, but rather you can acknowledge that the problem exists, and you can make sure they understand that there's going to be leeway for them at work. There's going to be leeway for them to work through that thing, however long it takes, and know that their job is safe. Know that we're going to have regular check-ins. I want you to keep me updated, but don't worry about this. We got this. We know that you have this going on. This is the most important thing right now. I got you. And just saying that and going through those things with your people will make it more likely that it won't become a vicious cycle where the person starts to become worried about their job. It's like you start worrying about your personal life for a long enough time, and you start thinking, wait a minute, I'm not committed to my job right now. Then you start to wonder, wait a minute, are people seeing that I'm not committed to my job right now? Then you start to worry about your job, and that just raises the level of stress you might be feeling in your own life, and it becomes this kind of cycle. So yeah, I agree. This is a 100% leadership responsibility here to kind of to make sure that everybody understands that when it comes to priorities, we're not just talking about work priorities. We're talking about the priorities of your people and what helps them both physically, mentally, spiritually, socially. All of these things work together. And if you can pull out all the stops as a leader, you'll get that level of commitment when the person is able to do it.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1 minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
All right, for this episode's 1 minute hack, here's what I want you to do. You need to do a good job as a leader assessing the level of commitment people have. Everybody can be committed to something, and if they enjoy whatever it is that they're doing, they'll be more likely to be committed to it. So I want you to start adding in this a question into your assessment processes for hiring, interviewing, those kind of things that will assess the level of commitment people have. And it could be a question like, tell me about a time when you had to really persevere to get a job done, or get a project done, or something done that you where at times you thought you weren't going to be able to get it done, and what you had to go through in order to kind of get over those roadblocks and persevere and get it done. And you could get answers ranging from, my parents couldn't pay for college, so I had to work 2 full-time jobs, and then, in order to pay for college, and it took me 7 years to get it done, to I stayed up for 4 nights straight without sleep so I could, play, Call of Duty with friends. The answers can run the gamut here, but your goal is to assess the level of commitment that people have for things and how they're willing to talk about it. Because if a person can't even articulate how they got something done or what they had to be committed to, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to give the level of commitment that you're going to be looking for when it is called upon or when it is needed. But if they have examples of this, then it means that they have that within them. They have that ability to commit to something. And then now it's on you as a leader to make sure that what they're committed to are the things that the team is committed to. And that's where you can, kind of make sure that everybody's aligned on the same priorities. All the aligning in the world is not going to do anything for a person who just doesn't have it in them to be committed to anything. They're just kind of going through the motions. So it's really important that you hire for the right people to begin with.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack and a good reminder of the importance of talent selection and talent assessment. And I think I'm always a big proponent on what questions are we asking. And I think there are definitely, like every organization, has hiring questions and things like that. And I think you've got to work through those to make sure that you have, consistent questions across the board. But I always enjoy some of the follow-up questions or digging a little bit deeper and asking things that help me to also better assess things like that. Like how is somebody committed to just the things that they're interested in? Like, does that show up in hobbies, professional world, personal world, education, whatever that might be? How are, people thinking about their learning over time and continuing to be a learner? And how do people see, in specifically in retail, like customer service, and what's their bar for that, and what do they think of when it comes to like taking care of people and stuff like that. So I appreciate that specific of a question, and that it does give some glimpse into how people define commitment for themselves. And I think that can be really helpful when you're looking at building teams that can be high performing teams over time.
Yeah, and most importantly, don't fall into the trap of projecting what commitment looks like to you onto people and then holding them accountable to that standard. If what you define as commitment are towards things that are different than what other people have been committed to, that doesn't mean that they won't come through for you or that they won't be committed to the job. It just means that you have different interests, different priorities, that you have different lives, different experiences, and that commitment comes up in different ways. So this is really important here, because if a person is committed to things in their personal life, or if they're looking at the job as a stepping stone to something else, that level of commitment might not look the same for one person as it does to you. And so being aligned on that with what your people are willing to be committed to and where they're willing to show up, and the things that they're willing to put on the back burner in order to focus on this particular thing that you want to focus on, those kind of things, they only happen well when there's a level setting up front and when there's communication up front. If you don't do that in advance, you as a leader will end up looking at a person's inability to perform in a certain way as a lack of commitment, when in actuality, it might not be that at all.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.